Welcome back from the break. My name is Paul Ohm. I am a professor at the University of Colorado Law School. It's really a privilege to be here, so thank you to the organizers. That first panel was incredible, and I learned so much and was so impressed by kind of the depth. And I think our panel is going to deliver as well. We are, the title says, a deep dive on new opportunities and challenges in healthcare and education. I can't do the biographies of the panelists justice. I refer you to the biographies that have been made available, so let me just do brief introductions. We have Barbara Koenig, who is a professor at the Institute for Health and Aging at UC San Francisco. Deven McGraw, who directs the Health Privacy Project at the Center for Democracy and Technology. Zach Pardos at the end. Sorry, I'm going in my order, not yours. Professor who's jointly appointed here at the School of Information and the Graduate School of Education. And Scott Young, who's the Executive Director, Senior Medical Director of Kaiser Permanente's Care Management Institute. After that last panel, entirely comprised of attorneys, we now bring you a panel where there's really only 2 attorneys if you're willing to include the moderator, and we have a medical doctor, so if something happens, we should be able to recover. So let me start by a little bit of framework and context, but I really am going to follow Deirdre's wonderful lead and try and encourage a very casual and free-flowing conversation, one that will bring in all of you. And I've been told to also exhort the webcast viewers to send us email. There's a link somewhere, and the questions will appear here, and I'll probably ignore them, but I will try and remember not to ignore them, so please do send them in. So in privacy law, and I'm a privacy scholar first and foremost, in privacy law, we have been encouraged to take a contextual turn by many of our really important colleagues. There was a time when the most embarrassing thing you could say as a United States expert in privacy is, yes, we're still focused on sectors. We apologize to the rest of the world. But in the last 5 years, we've learned not to be so apologetic. We've learned that given the deep complexities and intricacies of privacy policy, it makes sense to study context deeply, intrinsically, and with subject matter experts. And so when it comes to big data, it makes sense that we, too, are going to take the contextual turn at this point. And along the way, I think, are going to try and talk about things like harms and benefits and context and consent and things that the first panel began to explore. We're going to try and go even deeper on them. And so kind of as a cheap way to allow the panelists to give you a little bit of background and talk about some of the work that they're focused on, the first question is, we really do think about these important value-laden questions having to do with data as a contest between benefits and harms. And some of our panelists have thought a lot about the benefit side. So here's the kind of benefit part of the panel. Let's hear you, and I'm going to start with you, Zach, who comes from the field of education more than health. Talk a little bit about kind of some of the things you can do with big data, with predictive analytics, with data analysis, when it comes to educating children and other people as well.
Sure. So I guess you call it educational data science, or performing actions to benefit the student based on data. It started in intelligent tutoring systems 20 years ago. And the primary use of big data was to adjust your models of practice. So what's the optimal amount of practice a student should do on a particular skill or item? How do you optimize the time that they spend so they'll learn deepest and so they'll retain that knowledge, but also being able to measure the decay of skills over time. So when do you need to readdress that cognitive construct that they've learned so that they can perform better on a test or achieve other learning objectives? As digital has become deeper embedded in higher education, there's now opportunities, such with massive open online courses, to further that research into post-secondary education. So a really exciting area right now is to look at all the different pathways that students are taking through courses and observe what they're succeeding with, and then try to bring that information to bear on other struggling students. So take a student who's succeeding, who's in a similar proximal area of development of background knowledge to a struggling student, and use that information to remediate and help them to get on that successful student's path.
And it seems to me, I want to hear a little bit more about kind of breaking down this. So it seems like we're talking about, and pardon me if these aren't the right words, an infrastructure of surveillance and then infrastructure of analysis. Right? You need to gather the data first, and I know surveillance is a loaded term, so feel free to pick another. And then you need to analyze it. Where has the revolution occurred? What's the more important piece of it? Or is it both? I mean, or is there something else I'm missing? Right?
Part of this evolution and why there's a nice opportunity right now that didn't exist before is the breadth of information being collected about student pathways. So it used to be for K-12 systems, you had student information, mainly their correctness responses, what they answered incorrect and what they answered correct, but they were really just given a series of items in a fairly constrained system that's quite linear.
Right.
So in these new systems, there's a redundancy of information across the system: book pages, tutorial videos, discussion board, wiki pages. So there's a plethora of resources, and you can track students' access of these learning objects and thereby find a signal that you could call learning. So there's some now variance in the pathways that students are taking, where before it's much more sequential and much more fixed sequence. So there's a greater variety of information now to find a signal in.
So let's turn to Scott then. And it was fascinating to sit across from you at dinner last night and hear about, and the way you described this is, here we have the largest managed care system perhaps in the world other than state-run systems. And you run this very fascinating institute that's trying to answer lots of questions, not just big data questions. So tell us a little bit about the big data story as it applies to kind of Kaiser, the work that you're doing.
So Kaiser Permanente, we take care of about 3% of the U.S. population. So we are kind of, by definition, 9.2 million members. Kind of by definition, it's big data. I mean, just in taking care of these folks. But there's kind of the story kind of inside the house of medicine with big data, the traditional story about tracking blood pressures and glucose, figuring out who did better at taking care of diabetics or people with cancer, which we've gotten better and better at in healthcare. And then when we started thinking about health instead of healthcare, really how do we keep people from ever needing to have an encounter with the healthcare system? Most people don't get up in the morning and say, I haven't been to the ER for a while. I kind of missed that experience. I'm just going to pop on down there and wait in line. So how do we kind of keep people from having that experience? And that's when we start thinking about health. That's outside the house of medicine there. And it really is healthy schools, healthy communities. Really, how do I measure what's in your Fitbit? How do I know that you're getting a healthy diet? How do I measure those and kind of bring it into that sphere and that discussion and start thinking about population care in a very different way. And for us, that's the journey we're on now. Of course, we take big data and use it inside traditional healthcare, but then it's like, how do I keep you well? And what does that look like? And then the final kind of, or one of the newer frontiers in that is new ways of giving healthcare services. At Kaiser Permanente, we're going to start offering video visits in Sacramento, I think either later on this month or next month. And so we'll roll that out system-wide, and you start thinking about the difference between the written traditional medical record and lab tests, and then video, where I can actually start reading your expressions. Reading what that looks like, and actually start thinking about care from an ethnographic perspective in a very real way.
And is this video that kind of they come to the hospital and you tape them, or is this video from their living room on their smartphone, or all of the above? I mean, what's the delivery you're talking about here?
Well, right now we're starting, very small, so very secure pathways in that. But I think we can see has security measures, and if we get more sophisticated in that there'll be more and more the smartphone, or the I'm kind of on travel and I've got this issue, and I mean, I'm a family practice doctor. There's lots of things that I can take care of without having somebody physically there with me. I can go, that rash, go get some steroid and just take care of that. And it's very easy. Or we start thinking about the realm of behavioral health. Where do you feel most comfortable telling people your story and receiving those therapies? It might be at home where you feel most comfortable talking about that, or someplace else. And so when we start thinking about big data and health and health care, it really is kind of this multifaceted story. And then there's really big data, which is genomics.
Right. So that's a perfect segue.
Right?
So thank you. So let's go to Barbara. And Barbara, you've been a pioneer in bioethics kind of in lots of different contexts, but it seems like you're really engaged these days on genomics and biorepositories, biobanks, which is a phrase I don't use very often, so you can help educate me a little bit more on that.
Okay.
But let's talk about the benefits of this kind of research.
Benefits. So I'll try and speak to this issue of biobanks, and I definitely feel like I've come over from my silo on the other side of the bay at UCSF. And I'm a little uncomfortable with all the lawyers, but I will do my best here. So let me, and building on what was just discussed about Kaiser. So one of the, and we think about big data, well, another, a recent big science project was, of course, the mapping of the human genome, which has led to the possibility of getting very detailed genomic information about individuals. And so, but to really harvest the fruits of that big science project, it's absolutely critical to have a way of studying large numbers of people for long periods of time, and preferably in a way where you can link information from these wonderful electronic health records like exist at Kaiser with other genomic information. And to give you an example, actually Kaiser, Northern California, has the biggest, one of the biggest such biorepositories, or a resource that links genomic data to electronic health record data in the country. It's called the Research Program on Genes, Environment, and Health. And there are a lot of collaborations between UCSF and Kaiser to try and figure out what the right sort of ethics and regulatory framework is to learn how to translate these genetic findings into actual advances in the clinic, in the traditional healthcare setting, but also into the public health arena. And so I guess at the moment I would say that there aren't a lot of concrete, it's mostly a promise at this point. And as well as a sort of requirement that you have to have these systems that actually in some case require identified data, not de-identified data. So that's another, I think, sort of challenge. Traditionally, one of the ways of protecting information in health research, in medical record research, was to sort of quote unquote de-identify people. Well, that's moving a little bit more into some of the challenges and the harms, but I think for many kinds of research that's no longer possible, because obviously you need to have a way of getting back to individuals, tracking them over time, and really looking at the issue of what these genomic findings mean over the long term.
And as some in the audience know, topic near and dear to my heart, and I want to explore de-identification in a few minutes.
Okay.
And genomics are a really interesting test case. So Deven, if you're happy to, I'd like to transition a little bit, talk a little bit more about the benefits, but also start to put some of the harms on the table. But I suppose before we do that, so it's obligatory in a big data conference for someone to say, big data saves lives, and none of you use that phrase. Is anyone willing to cop to that? Scott,
sure.
Are you going to? Devin? Yeah, we just have to put that on the table,
Yeah,
right?
no, I mean, it can. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having these conversations,
Okay,
right?
so big data saves lives, we've said it.
Yes, yes, I think
Check
we
the
can
box.
say that.
Okay, good.
And if it doesn't save lives, can it at least reduce costs, right? You know?
Oh, come on. Talk about the sacred to the profane. Fine. But let's reflect on kind of some of what you've heard, not just in health, which is where you focus most, but in education. But begin to transition us a little bit to concerns.
Sure.
And the first panel did such a nice job of exploring that, but we can lend
We'll
some
get there, I'm sure.
Yeah, sure.
I think one of the, I mean, clearly, even though I do work on the privacy issues, I wouldn't be doing the work if I didn't believe in the potential benefits for the data. And what I think is another unique aspect that is probably true of both health and educational data is the community needs for everyone's data to be part of big data analytics, right? We're not going to learn about what treatments work best in certain populations unless everyone, or nearly everyone, participates in those studies. And already from a legal, in terms of how the laws govern the way that big health data is utilized in traditional healthcare systems like academic medical centers and physician offices, there are uses for which you can't opt out of them, and you are permitted to use data in order to examine quality, for example. And you can't say, I don't want my data to be part of this. So there already has been a little bit of a conversation about balancing this issue of control versus communitarian needs to improve the healthcare system, which has an impact on all of us. And so I suspect, although I don't do work in educational at all, that may be true there too, right? You want to sort of see patterns of what works, and the absence of people participating in that pattern-based examination would be problematic. So there is this sort of need in leveraging opportunities for big data to think of the big tent aspect of it, right? Can we create a regime where people are not just understand that this is what's happening to data, but that they understand actually that there may be little control that you have there. At the same time, starting to get into the harm aspect of it, we have a big problem if we breach trust, right? If we can't give people at least some provisional guarantees or some assurances that their data is not going to be misused. And that gets to the issue of harm, and I think we could delineate sort of what those harms would be in both an education and a healthcare context in a really direct way. Financial harms, harms to dignity, embarrassment, but there's also a harm that we talk a lot, which is the harm to collective trust of people in the healthcare system, right? I will not go get treatment for this condition unless I think that there are some parameters around who can see this data. Can my neighbor who works at the hospital see that I'm coming in to terminate a pregnancy? Can my, can my employer find out about this and this particular health condition that I'm dealing with? Will anybody that I know find out that I am dealing with depression? I don't want that to happen, and if I can't get some sort of guarantee, I will not go into the healthcare system. If I go in, I will not be entirely truthful about what's going on in my life. And we know from survey data that people actually do that. So what
they do that by they withhold information.
Withhold information. Jan Larry Goldman, who is the founder of the Health Privacy Project.
Do they do it rationally? I mean, have we been able to figure out if they're rationally responding to trust, or it's no? This is just.
I'm not sure it's a completely rash. It's a knee-jerk gut reaction, but that has a real impact on people seeking care. So how are we able to again leverage data in a way that again we probably need everyone's data for a lot of the questions.
So I want to push on that. I mean, you've put a lot of interesting things on the table, but this idea that there's this kind of communitarian value to sharing, right? I've just read Dave Eggers' The Circle, and that's a big part of it, right? Sharing is caring, and if you're not sharing, you're not with the rest of us. I would love to hear others react to that. Now, I think the way you said it was very broad and categorical. I mean, it's almost like you can do very little of this research unless you have the full population. I mean, it seems to me that may not always be the case. Like if you have smaller populations, or if you have kind of very, 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 small little things, maybe you could account for people opting out. I don't know. I mean, what is Deven right to kind of put on the table? We're all in this together, and if we opt out, we're in real trouble. Do you guys all agree with that?
Yeah. So this has been a real current issue in education in terms of sharing data, especially with massive open online courses. A university has access to its own data, but if we're talking about how students learn more broadly, what kind of pedagogies are best for students of a certain background or certain background knowledge, it's important to share data so we can address the learning question more broadly. And that's right now a very touchy issue in terms of if we have a student who's used Berkeley X to take a course, and we have other students taking Coursera courses or Berkeley or other X consortium courses on edX.org. Can we share data? What are the legal restrictions to doing that? Can you have a shared repository for data? And what are the expectations of the students? They may expect that the institution will look at their data in order to improve instruction, but will they expect that other institutions will be looking at their data to tackle the same problems? I think we should create a norm that we can all work together as a consortium for the betterment of their experience, but I don't know if that norm exists.
Yeah, and it was
right
implicit
now.
in what you said, but I want you to make sure you bring it all the way back.
All right.
Because if we don't have all the data, we're just not going to know as much, or we're not going to help as much.
We're going to have holes in our knowledge, and if what we're really after is to create a better theory that guides us forward.
I mean, has there ever been in the history of the world a big data analyst who has said, I don't need any more data, right? I'm fine. You can kind of leave this out. I'll be just as good, right? Like, does the NSA say this, or in your context, is this ever the answer, right?
I have no idea about the NSA, but I'll let them speak for themselves or not. For us, as we start shaping questions, more and more and finer around preferences, around ethnicities and genders, around different communities, around how people want care, how they need to receive that care. Right. I really kind of need everybody in at that point, into that discussion. We started answering kind of the big questions around hypertension or some cancers or prevention. Kind of, there was kind of good enough data sets. I mean, you got to a point where it's good enough. But then when I said, what does it take for me to reduce hypertension in Richmond, California, or Boulder, Colorado, or Tulsa, Oklahoma? I mean, when I need to start thinking about, and all the kind of the different subpopulations, rural, suburban, these sorts of things, rich, poor, what does it take for me to answer those questions? Then I need a much broader, a much richer data set than what I had before. Suddenly the JAMA article, randomized controlled trials, just doesn't cut it anymore around that. And I think we're at that cusp of, kind of that translation between big data and personalized healthcare, at least in our realm. And it takes very different data sets, and I would say much more diverse and bigger ones to get there.
Now, Barbara, that certainly isn't my understanding of how biobanks are being established today, right? I haven't heard this kind of imperative that we all need to be in there. I hope that my DNA is not my genome yet. No one's, at least as far as I know, right? I mean, is the answer a little different because we're still at an early stage and some data is better than no data? I don't know.
It's a little different, and one also has to ask the question of, are there health applications, especially public health applications, that are different than some of the commercial applications, for example, that we were talking about in the past panel. There are some systems in the United States, and some of us talk about it as the Vanderbilt model, for example, where the regime that they have in place for getting genomic data linked to the electronic health record is a system of implied consent, where leftover blood samples are entered into their biorepository. That's the sort of minority way of doing this. In most other cases, biobanks there's more active upfront engagement with participants about being part of these biorepositories. So your DNA is probably not, although the exception might be if you participated in a direct-to-consumer genetic testing company, and in those situations, there is the implied, there's, I think, actual explicit idea that those will be shared with researchers later.
Yeah. So we've only begun to scratch the surface of harms, and Deven has kind of teed up a few financial dignity, embarrassment, other things that could happen if data flows in a way you don't intend, or even if it does flow in a way you intend, but you do something with the data that the data subject may not want. Zach, you actually have a puzzled look on your face, you don't kind of think that this is a large problem in the education context, right? I mean, so what do you think about when you think about the harms of data and data analysis, privacy or not, other things?
So I guess the puzzled look comes from a couple places. One is myself and other colleagues, when doing research in K-12, K-12 institutions have been quite cooperative in giving us IRB permissions. There has been a point where this kind of breach concern exists, and that's typically in institutions that are hosting online education platforms. So take a Khan Academy or any of the post-secondary education platforms. What would be nice to see is public access to de-identified data sets, but there you have the embarrassment factor. But it's not embarrassment of the students, it's embarrassment of the platform. And especially when you have this mode of education where it's free, it's uncertain what is incentivizing the students to come and access the website, and anything you do that could embarrass the platform could affect the students coming into there. But there is a concern, especially when it comes to looking at what students are doing as a whole and trying to summarize improved pedagogical response to them. Let's say a student is struggling with an algebra problem, and we see that they go to a particular video and we want to recommend that video to other students like that. Well, we might find if we cut the data between females and males, there's a different video that you might choose. But do we really want to be suggesting resources based on some characteristic of the student that they may not want to receive information that this is the female recommendation, right? So you have to be careful when training these models not to bias the type of information.
But that's interesting. So, and that must, again,
There's
kind of cut against
personalization.
Well, and it cuts against the way you're thought to build these models, right? I mean, you train them on the data, and then whatever spits out at the end spits out. Instead, you feel these constraints, whether ethical, social, legal, right? I mean, is this a regrettable thing that we should kind of learn to move past, or does it kind of make sense that we still draw some lines? Ken Bamberger was talking on the last panel about allowing the analysis to kind of pigeonhole a child into kind of a particular destiny in life, and never shall they escape from that. I mean, how does this work for you? Like these lines that we're talking about.
So it's essential to research. So we do see these trends, and if there are student covariates such as gender or race, and trying to explain them for ourselves to figure out what's going on there. But not pigeonholing a student. I think one of the pathways to deal with that is give the student choice. Allow them to choose what resource among a set list.
So it's like health. Here's your diagnosis. Here's the prescription, the prescribed treatment. Take it or leave it, right?
That's right. So that's one thing that can moderate that risk. Is
are we really giving them a choice, or are we giving them 3 choices and they're all kind of pigeonholing them in this way?
Well, you would give them choices that don't pigeonhole, as well as choices that maybe are based on personalization. Right. But there's a range of systems or proposed systems, and education really is at this inflection point right now, as it has been for a couple of years, where we have the data, we have the promise of what it can do, but let's see some real outcomes. So when it comes to student choice, you don't want to impose upon them, but that's something we have to be careful.
So Scott, one thing, kind of the work of Deirdre and Ken have focused us on is how institutions deal with kind of concerns like this. So can you characterize for us, if you feel free, the kind of role that harm and fear of harm or loss of trust plays in the decisions to pursue or not pursue a particular kind of data plan or data research? Right? Well, I mean, is it always in the back of your mind? Is it the annoying thing your lawyers talk to you about? Is it all of the above?
I'm surrounded by lawyers, so we're never annoyed by lawyers. They're
lovable, yeah.
Straight line to the door. And so it is something that we always think about, and we think about it from a couple of venues. One is the personal harm to that individual. I mean, if we inadvertently, Deven talked about, expose somebody's condition, HIV positive, drug abuser, depression, something that because we get to know people's deepest, darkest secrets. I mean, we're privy to some of their most private information that they tell us. And so being good stewards of that and making sure that comes in a secure way is good for us, because we don't want to cause harm to that individual first. And the second thing is I actually want you to make a choice. I actually want you to pick a therapy. And if you don't trust me, you're not going to choose that therapy. I mean, I've now kind of done you harm, my reputation, additional harm, but I've actually probably nullified the therapies that I might offer you. So it kind of multiplies upon itself, and we think about that all the time. What kind of reports are we going to run? What kind of queries are we going to do? Can we actually kind of see an endpoint here that's actually going to make you better, healthier? It even goes to the point of who are our partners, and we're heavily regulated as an industry. Education is as well. Heavily regulated. How we collect information, how we share information, how we store information. Yet we want to partner with individuals, especially in the big data context, who are not as heavily regulated. Actually have a very different view of data and data trust than we do. So whatever their bar is, we suffer those slings and arrows as well. So it's limiting for us as far as partnerships and innovation, but also at the same time, we always kind of keep an eye on that individual and how am I helping that individual by either running or not running a query.
One thing we've been thinking about a lot in privacy is the notion of privacy by design, that these kind of ethical choices get pushed down, not just in the C-suite, but throughout the institution. Is you lead a big team.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when you hire data analysts, I'm guessing,
I
kind
do.
of shortly out of school. Like, do they seem to understand the kind of harm imperative, the ethical imperative, or is this something that they just like write down and say that again, okay? And
There's
I've got to avoid
a little bit of writing
like,
down.
Okay.
I think there's a little bit of writing down. We have at Kaiser Permanente a couple of years ago, we have about 700 different databases, in our organization. So that's huge in a healthcare entity to have that many different databases. So if you're an analyst, young analyst, experienced analyst, whatever, I mean, this is a candy store. To kind of come into, and I haven't even brought in the genomics work and the DOR work into that. It becomes this huge thing, and I mean, for us, we instill in our teams very early on. This is a trust that's been given to us. This data is a trust. We look at it very carefully. We have kind of this watchword: making the right thing to do easy, and there's two parts to that. It's actually figuring out what the right thing is to do for our members and our patients. And that's actually pretty straightforward from the data and big data. But that second part of how do we make that easy for our patients and our members, how do you actually kind of deliver it to your iPad, deliver it to your home, deliver the kind of care and services that you want, that's the part where we really go into the queries very deeply. It's the hardest part, and it's the area where we see people kind of rooting around. In data fields, we say, no, stop that. We actually have to do this by design. We actually have to walk a path going there. We're a little slow doing it that way, and we know that, but we know that we'll preserve that trust in the end.
So Barbara, then to close out kind of the harm conversation, like genomics strikes me as maybe different. Maybe. I mean, first of all, I was struck that you said the benefits haven't been realized. Right. The harms haven't been realized, but we're talking about kind of propensity to disease, maybe the kind of troubled eugenic background in some of the research. I mean, are these harms things that are salient that researchers in these biobank institutions think a lot about?
Well, I would say that in the biobank and the genomic data context, we really know neither the harms nor the benefits, nor the full benefits. So we're in it's a complicated issue at the moment. Some of the harms are, actually, I would say that at this point in time, the information that is available through the health record is much more of concern than most of the predictive genetic information, with some exceptions. As we get more and more deep, so for example, full sequence data that does reveal a lot of very rare variant susceptibility to very rare Mendelian conditions, those, of course, are important and significant, and you want those protected by a strong privacy regime. I want to come back to the issue, though, of how an institution maintains its trustworthiness in the face of these kinds of concerns. And one of the things that came up a lot in the last session were the concepts of transparency and control. And I think that perhaps one of the things that those of us on the health side can contribute to this conversation is to maybe give you a bit of a heads up on what some of the limitations of focusing on absolute control could be, and think about some other possible models for how to deal with things like upfront consent or notifications about privacy. Now, we have this big bad, which I think of as a big bad rule in the background of HIPAA, which requires a lot of automatic disclosure. We have the common rule and other requirements for human subjects research. The problem is, and I'm an anthropologist, so I'm going to take a completely different take on this. I actually study these practices out in the world as they get employed. And I will say that meaningless, someone on the last panel said that they become sort of meaningless bureaucratic rituals and they don't really have much impact. I've actually done research at the Mayo Clinic and other places where we'll follow people through the process after they've been given some of this information about, for example, how their genomic data is going to be shared along with other things. And 10 minutes later, no one has any idea what you've talked about. So that, or that they were even in research. So I think there's some real problems to the sort of privacy as control model. There, in my experience, especially when you deal with really sick people, as opposed to all of us who may be just delighted to go in and work on our privacy settings in our various programs. Once you get really sick, you aren't likely to want to get out of your hospital bed and go over to a computer and do that at that point. So that's an important issue. I think one of the things that I've worked on is trying to figure out alternative models of governance for these kinds of situations where, like biobanks, where you really can't predict what the harms are going to be in 25 or 50 years. And so, for example, one of the things that I've done both here in California and in Minnesota at the Mayo Clinic was to try and develop more public-facing governance through examples like doing deliberative democracy exercises to allow people to to express what kinds of defaults they would like in these systems up front before they're actually in the situation, rather than relying on each individual.
Systemic basis. They're assessing the system. Right?
Yeah, to essentially set the mechanisms for governance and to create a mechanism that might have adaptive governance so that you can change. So suddenly we can read the genomic data and get some kinds of information that we hadn't imagined 5 years ago, or we now have a new requirement for sharing that we didn't know about. And what kind of an organization or what kind of a community advisory board, say, do you want that can give that advice to an institution like Kaiser or to another healthcare institution that really governs these biobanks?
But, and I want to get to governance in a second, but it's one thing to say HIPAA's model of notice and choice, or at least notice, is broken. It's another to say this is an intractable problem. You never could have a notice regime that would meaningfully impart the information that the person needs. Are you making the second broader claim or the narrower first claim? Like, could we just tweak notice? Could we fix notice under HIPAA before we throw it out in place, of deliberative democracy and governance?
I guess I personally would throw it out because I think that many of these questions are not individual choice. They're more about collective issues, especially in the public health arena. And
it's kind of Deven's theme about the communitarian. Okay, so what I want to pivot to really quickly, and Deven, I'm going to start with you, is we keep talking about the researcher, right? This mythical person, probably in a white lab coat, and given the composition of who you are up here, associated with a large, sophisticated, wealthy institution with lots of resources and oversight in a general counsel's office, right? But both Zach and Barbara have teed up kind of what is happening to the rest of the world, right? I'm a legal educator, and I'm constantly told that I'll be out of a job soon because we only need 12 law professors and everything will be a MOOC.
You'll be one.
Oh, good. Thank you. All right. And then I'll probably be able to demand
Big data
very
made
high
that
salary.
decision,
Yes,
Paul. You're in.
Right. So is everything we're saying, right, how does it change when we're talking about the Silicon Valley startup who is, part of healthcare, who is part of education care, who is part of genomic research, who has people they call data scientists? You notice you never meet a statistician anymore? They're all data scientists, including the good people who are trained at this university. Is the discussion different? Like, do we have to worry about different things when we talk about the new wave of research? With health and education, but health because you focus so much on it.
I probably should stick to health. One thing, though, I do want to say about, because I just can't let Barbara's throw it away comment go, and have been equally critical of notice and consent regimes, but why are we always relying on one tool, right? Yeah. Oh, well, it's notice and consent, and then it's okay. Or it's de-identification, and therefore it's okay, as opposed to a whole lot of mechanisms for good data stewardship, of which institutions of accountability, governance, decisions about fairness, objective evaluations of questions that we're asking, greater accountability, that there are all these tools that we totally underutilize because we're so wedded to consent and control, even though we're watching it fall apart before our very eyes and going, oh, well, now what do we do, right? We have completely underutilized a whole lot of tools that ought to be in the tool shed. Yeah. Now shifting to the question you actually asked me, which is, I actually do think that context matters, right? And so if you are talking about an institution like Kaiser, where they have a commitment to delivering good care for their patients, and it translates into how they deal with patient data, because they want to be on the right side of serving patients, and their sort of business model is delivering good patient care and handling people's data appropriately and having patients trust them is part of that whole model. Not sure that that always applies. In fact, sometimes I'm sure it doesn't apply in some commercial contexts where the collection of health data from consumers has both a mix of doing well for them so that they continue to use the product and generate revenue for the business, but also a monetization of the underlying data in ways that serve the company, but for which sometimes there's a link to public good, and sometimes there's a tenuous link to public good, and sometimes you could argue there's very little link to public good unless you really believe that public good includes a free market economy where people make a lot of money. Right?
And some do, right?
Yeah, of which that question is actually a hard one to answer in health, right? Because we do have a free market-based healthcare economy where ideally the companies that win are the ones that deliver the products that work, and there is a data component to all of that. So how do you sort of judge, like, what are the uses of data for which we ought to have on guard, and what sort of rules would we craft or best practices would we craft around in the commercial space where there's probably almost always a mix of sort of, there's an interest of patients and the public and health being served, but there is also a shareholder interest and a money interest, and sometimes they're aligned, and sometimes it's harder to see where that alignment is. And then you have Supreme Court decisions that make it harder for you to draw lines around commercial uses and non-commercial uses. Right, as a good, bad sort of.
So maybe it's all speech.
Carve it out.
Right, maybe data is speech, and then we can all go home because we're done regulating.
We're done.
So Scott, shouldn't we just encourage the White House to pass a law that says only big hospitals should be allowed to do medical research? And as a lawyer, I advise you not to answer that question. But but if you could put yourself in the place of kind of the startup across the bay, right? Should kind of the same concerns about benefits and harm and ethics and everything we've been talking about apply over there, or are they delivering something different?
So
you talked about Fitbit, in fact.
So in the first place, our general counsel thanks you right now, and so we will send that along. So two things. Now I want to touch on one. We think that probably the privacy regulation and laws that we have now are not perfect. Probably, I'm not ready to get rid of HIPAA, and you just have to kind of go back into the Federal Register and read what happened, back in the days before HIPAA, and you read these horror stories. So not perfect. Maybe look at, amend things like that, but not ready to get rid of. So I just want to, with due respect, put that out there. To the startups, who we talk to all the time. I mean, they're talking to us, quite a bit. Fitbit, others. How do we go with this? We have these kind of discussions. How are you going to monetize this? And every once in a while the answer is, well, we're going to take this data and we're going to maybe make it available to certain pharmaceutical companies to do research. And we go, wait a minute. Here I am, trying to be good stewards of our patients' health and dollars, and you're going to give data that we generate together to a pharmaceutical company who's going to come right back, with what we would call some inflationary pricing on things. This just doesn't work for us. I mean, so right off the bat, that's no. Maybe you need to go find another partner here. Again, it gets into this kind of two different rules that we look at. Deven talked about kind of this immense trust that we have with our members and patients, which is sacrosanct. I mean, it's foundational, bedrock. If we lose that, we lose everything in the health and healthcare arena. Whereas somebody who may just be, I'm in this, and we're in this space for a long time. I mean, we are your doctor, your healthcare provider for the rest of your life, that sort of thing. So we're in this for the long haul. Versus somebody who, well-meaning as they might be, come into this, I'm going to be in this until it works or doesn't work, and then I'm moving on. Very different temporal relationship they have with this, and if it doesn't work for them, it doesn't work for them. If it doesn't work for us, somebody gets hurt. I mean, and I say hurt, I mean literally hurt. This is kind of life and limb questions that we deal with. So yeah, we have different standards. And we have kind of these, and it is a constant problem for us that we're trying to solve, because we actually want to be able to have those conversations with companies like, I mean, we're picking on Fitbit, but there's many others, because that's what you eat, how you move, how you sleep, your education, how much money you make. I mean, these are actually big deals for your health. So we care about that, and we kind of care about being able to have that kind of a view into our patients and our members, and we can't violate the trust at the same time. And so to us, it's a really different dialogue than HIPAA envisioned. And so
Right.
it's building.
And you weren't talking about throwing out all of HIPAA, right? You were focused, or do you want to throw out all of HIPAA?
Well, no, I mean, but the original intent of HIPAA was to regulate electronic transmission of data. So, I mean, I didn't want to throw that part of it out. But I just want to
I don't want to pick on you.
But I do want to respond just a tiny bit. I mean, what we're really talking about is how to promote virtuous behavior. And I think that in the context of healthcare, we're really talking in many cases about professionalism and professional values, and the fact that we, doctors, nurses, other people have fiduciary relationships, and their purpose is to benefit the patient. That's where we get into the difference between patients and consumers. It's not just about buying and selling things. So that's really
But
that's
you said two different things. You said
I did.
You said their purpose is the patient's not the commercial side.
Right.
But then later on you said just. You said it's not just the profit side, right? I mean, healthcare,
Well, I mean, because
healthcare is also a business, right?
Healthcare is also a business. I mean,
In some places, in some parts of the world.
right, and it's not everywhere, and there is, I think, a public health sector that is somewhat different. And just back to the issue about whether notification forms and authorization forms are adequate. I mean, the problem is if you ask anyone, do they like privacy? It's a motherhood and apple pie value. People will say, yes, I want my privacy. But I've actually had the experience of trying to gather, for example, 30 residents from California selected to represent the population, putting them in a room for 4 days and saying, okay, because the hard part is, okay, what are you willing to trade off from privacy to get other public goods? And people are actually able to have these conversations and to give very good advice and to be able to talk about the potential benefits that you get from some of these kinds of research or the kinds of quality systems that Deven talked about at the beginning, in which you don't have which you're not asked to give permission. So I think we can train ourselves to have these different kinds of conversations.
I mean, privacy scholars have engaged with this argument, and some of them at least have said, but it's a difficult balancing for a person to do, a patient or a consumer, because often the kind of privacy risk is very vague and distributed across time, and the benefit is the chocolate bar that's right in front of you, right? So.
Let me just quickly on this point. This is an important. We do a fair amount of ethnographic research. We kind of follow people kind of through, crucial periods in their health or healthcare experience, and one of those is when they get out of the hospital and go home. I think we travel, kind of figure out what are the commonalities in that. And one of the things that we found that was not stunning, if you think about it, but was stunning to us, it was people will sign just about anything to get out of the hospital. I mean, they will sign fine, the NCR paper, it's all good. And then when we kind of went back and queried people, what did the nurse say? What were the instructions? What were the admonishments? What happened? I don't know. And so when people were ready to sign something was when they were at home and in an environment where they could actually.
Ready to understand.
And so this sense of in critical life situations, when are you actually able to give consent? When are you able to actually, have that conversation with somebody, and where, because we get kind of temporarily disabled. I mean, it's, I'm sick. I'm care. The chocolate bar. You're like, we think we can make you better. I'm signing. Right. I mean,
it's a really
right
good
here?
chocolate bar. Right?
Yeah. I mean, so. Whereas if you would look at that kind of in the light of day, you might say, "Oh no, I don't know that I understood all that." But it's, to us there is this, when is the moment when you are actually able to give consent and you can do this?
Well, and I think there are differences in the research context and the clinical context, and those are very important distinctions. So.
Yeah. So Zach, then, I mean, you've already kind of endorsed, I think, implicitly, the kind of new, for-profit, kind of innovative MOOCs and things like this that are being set up. maybe not always for profit, sometimes under the auspices of traditional education. I mean, so what do you think about this idea that maybe we have two sets of standards, two sets of rules, descriptively, and also is that a good thing or a bad thing when it comes to education, privacy, data?
So, I mean, these things are early in development in education. They're more matured in health. So it's interesting to hear these stories and reflect on how that might project on the future of education. I guess the thoughts in terms of industry versus academia and FERPA being the main legislation that restricts education research or protects it. FERPA doesn't apply outside of educational institutions, but it does apply within educational institutions. It's interesting to look at these partnerships between Silicon Valley and academia in terms of post-secondary education platforms, because it really is in the case of Coursera, it's a Silicon Valley company, or edX, which is a not-for-profit spin-off, where FERPA doesn't necessarily apply, but with the branding of these schools and their pedagogies infused. So when you're talking about the expectations of students, they see, oh, I'm taking a Harvard course. I have all the protections that Harvard would afford me, and they care about me. But they're actually taking it on the software and properties of a Silicon Valley for-profit company. So this is sort of a gray area when it comes to talking to your IRB. Saying, I'm at an institution, I want to do some research. Does FERPA apply? The data is not coming from an institution. It's coming from a Silicon Valley corporation. In terms of is this good or bad, well, I think it can really handcuff academic progress because there's so many more hoops that you have to jump through if you're doing research out of the academy versus an industry.
Yeah, no, and I mean, that's a theme I've been exploring a little bit in some of my work. I mean, there seems to be an increasing jealousy from those in the academy for the kind of layers of regulation. I talk to a lot of social scientists who say, I would love to have what researchers at Facebook and Google have. And you know, there's two ways that can go. You can do, and I'm going to use my biased terms, a race to the bottom, where we all just throw out all of our protections, or a race to the top, where we kind of impose kind of additional protections on corporations. Right? There's no question there. I just decided to make a little speech. Okay, so we have 1 minute left before I want to turn to the audience, but for the de-identification nerds in the audience, and you know who you are, and Barbara and Deven, I think you two have engaged this topic the most. So I'm going to make a statement, and you correct me if it's wrong, Barbara. I think I've heard you talk a little bit about this. A genome is basically impossible to de-identify to a high degree of accuracy. Of confidence, that it cannot be re-identified. Is that true? I mean, we have the surname inference paper that came out in Science. We have other papers about actual live re-identification. It kind of has happened a little bit with genomes. What do we know now?
What we know is that there's no easy answer at this point in time. I think almost any scientist would make the claim that you, with the right reference database and a small number of points of genetic variation, you can make a conclusive link between a sample that's in a database and an individual. I think at the moment, probably that re-identification is not practicable in an everyday way. And indeed, my understanding, and unless the laws have changed very recently, is that under HIPAA, raw genetic sequence data is not considered a biometric identifier. So that's a little confusing because, and that definition of biometric identifier is, many years old, and whether it should be revised or changed is perhaps.
I want to make sure I understand. So because it's not a biometric identifier, what follows? That means?
That means that it's technically not within the HIPAA protection.
Oh, I see. If all you have is someone's genome, then you're just outside.
Right, exactly.
HIPAA.
And indeed,
it's not on the list of 18, and it's not right.
Precisely, and that's one of in the current human subjects protection regime, you can simply declare that you can use biological data and be outside the regime of human subjects protection and proceed to do your research claiming that you're doing non-human subjects research.
And you're not a lawyer, but I'm going to invite you to exercise the unauthorized practice of law, which is, I think, only a misdemeanor in California. So if you're going to advise a biobank about what to put in their disclosures, their consent form, about the chance that this can be re-identified, what do you advise them to put? knowing the best science that we have on this?
We say that it's impossible to de-identify this data.
You do say it's
we
impossible
do indeed,
to de-identify
that
this
it's
data.
impossible because it
Oh, I'm sorry, de-identify,
to
not re-identify.
de-identify.
Okay, thank you, good. I was, my head
to
turned
de-identify,
back,
and
yeah.
that there's always the possibility of
And
re-identification.
I think one of the prominent biobanks on the East Coast say, we can't make any guarantees. We may know that this is your genome, and you should do it anyway because it's good for community and society.
And we're thinking about this in the context that very soon, or one of the aspirational goals of a lot of the genomic scientists in their effort to translate these findings into the clinic is to very soon have full sequence data available that would be linked to electronic records or to other forms of record keeping. Now, there's some that's going to probably take a while to institutionalize.
So, Deven, I know you've written about this and in the HIPAA context in particular.
I think the biggest lesson that we've tried to put out there is that de-identification is only a tool, right, for protecting privacy, right? Never was it supposed to be a guarantee of anonymity.
Right.
And in fact, if you go back and look at the regulatory pages, they had an enormous amount of debate about whether the particular methodologies that you could use for de-identifying data were strong enough because people were seeking a zero-risk standard, or not quite, or too strong because it destroys the utility of data when you take identifiers out of it, depending on what you're trying to study. So it's just one way of sort of minimizing the risk that any particular analytic project is going to expose who's in it. Right? And you'll be able to identify the people and attributes or characteristics about them in a data set where otherwise your need for the data is, I just need to collectively know like how many patients respond, percentage of patients respond to this treatment. It doesn't at all address the issues of fairness of the data use to begin with. Right? It's just one tool, but people have, unfortunately in our law, we've layered a lot onto it, right? If you can characterize your data set as de-identified, HIPAA doesn't apply. Common rule doesn't apply. Most state privacy laws don't apply. And so people are sort of striving to reach that nirvana, even though, when frankly, it's a much more nuanced conversation, right?
But do we have a sense then for any measure whatsoever, or maybe even a good anecdote about research that we've foregone because they didn't have the data they needed, because they removed the 18 fields that they wanted?
Well, right. So just so in case there are people who don't know, they're under HIPAA, which I'm told by folks who do de-identification is the only place where we have legal standards around data anonymization.
Well, I mean, there are others, but this is much more specific.
It's very specific. 2 ways to get there. One way called Safe Harbor, meant to be a very easy cookbook methodology. You take out 18 types or categories of identifiers and you are home free, unless you have actual knowledge that your data set could be re-identified. And that's actual knowledge, not, well, maybe it still could, right? And then the other is a statistical method. It's applying, a learned statistician doing what statisticians do with data.
Data scientists.
Data scientists, thank you. People with a lot more schooling than me. Saying, essentially there is very low risk. There's no number in the law. Very low risk that this data set can't be re-identified. So, do we have sort of a regime that provides guarantees that it won't be re-identified? No, under neither methodology do you get there. But it's, they wanted to create something that would be easy for people to use so that they'd be less inclined to use fully identifiable data when they could get to a place where the data had some more protection to it, but it's not fully protected. And we need to stop acting like it is in terms of how we sort of treat these data sets and instead look more comprehensively at what are the risks in the data. You asked the question about whether people have been deferred from research. Sometimes in IRB, my understanding from talking to researchers is that they look at what they have to do to strip the 18 identifiers out. That's a path of least resistance for an IRB and legal counsel of an institution because it's a list of things and they have certainty, as opposed to a statistical methodology where you don't know if you've hired the right statistician and whether it's going to be questioned. You can go down that road, you can use it in your certain, and essentially it's taken so much data out of the data set that the question that they want to answer can no longer be answered. Dates have to be stripped out of a safe harbor de-identified data set. It's very hard to do healthcare research without dates. If you're doing geographic, research that is particular to a geography, you actually have to strip out addresses that are likely to peg a person in a data set, and you end up with these very large geographic representations that may not allow you to do the sort of geo-health research that you wanted. So just two examples.
I apologize,
Long-winded
this is my
response.
self-appointed deadline, but let's go to the audience, and if you have more to say on this. I want to do the microphone kind of carrying around, so I see a few hands. Why don't we go to the back of the room first? Oh, should I White House participants, do you? Okay. We're good.
Hi. So I'm still not convinced that we need everyone's data, and I'm wondering if opting in is still a viable method for doing research. And I'm wondering, to what extent have statistical tools, to what extent are they being used to ascertain how much data we really need to answer a well-defined health or education research question?
I mean, it seems to me there are clearly studies you can do without all the
well,
data.
Sometimes you
right?
can, but
like,
here's
I know enough about statistics
right,
to know
but here's the thing. If you're going, so one thing is, there are studies that have shown that there's a difference between people who volunteer and people who don't. And can you manage that from a statistical standpoint? Depending on which statistician you talk to, some will tell you yes and some will tell you no, and it probably depends on the research question that's being posed and how important those distinctions are to addressing the question. But I think the other thing we have to really grapple with is if we allow people out of research that we know we need to do to improve the healthcare system, are we creating a free rider problem? You're going in and benefiting, but you're not letting your data to be used to improve a system that we all have to eventually take part in one way or another. It's a question worth debating. I don't have a clear answer for it, but it is something that ethicists have raised, and I think it's worth paying attention to.
Any other quick responses?
Yeah, so again, it goes right to this issue of kind of heterogeneity of populations, right? I mean, we can say that we're going to study white males only, of somewhere between 50 and 55 years of age to some disease processes, of which we have many in my age group. So, sorry, newsflash. So we're just going to go and do this in Marin County, as opposed to Central Valley, right? I have just kind of predetermined, although I will get the statistical power. I mean, I actually, data scientists, statisticians, will actually figure this out. It'll look good. It'll get published, in a randomized control trial. It will end up, kind of in the nomenclature. Methodologists will use this to create guidelines, and it'll be wrong. And so do I need 300+ million Americans into this to answer certain questions? No. But I need to have kind of a rich representation of all the heterogeneity we have inside our populations to be able to answer the questions that are important to you, that are important to me, that are important to health systems. So yeah, I think so. And yeah, there's some questions we go, no, 200,000 people's enough. We got it. At this point. But we can't set that as the bar.
I want to make sure we're keeping the two things separate. And Barbara, you said you wanted to respond as well. So there's the question of can you do the science? And then the second one is, do we agree with Deven's communitarian exhortation, right? So if what we're talking about, and luckily I can talk about this because it's not a problem, like male pattern balding, I'm not sure we need to have a lot of kind of pressure on people to take part in this study because, right, but so it could be the life and death question again. Yeah. I want to make sure we keep those two things kind of separate, right? Barbara, you wanted to talk about
I just wanted to say that, you started your question with the concept of do we want to get rid of opt-in? And I don't want to get rid of opt-in, but what I'd like to do is make it a little more meaningful, a little less bureaucratic, and have it exercised with a little more care. And there's some situations where perhaps everyone should automatically be in to recognize Deven's communitarian value. And other cases where it's much more nuanced and complicated and you want a lot of effort in the opt-in. So I think the devil is really in the details about how much we want to actually do opt-in.
So the gentleman on the aisle had his hand up. The microphone's going to come up to you in a second. Oh, I'm sorry, Danny. I didn't know you had the mic. I'm going to give you the last question, Danny, after this.
Quickly, I'm a spatial epidemiologist. I deal with big data all the time in multiple big data sets all the time. And I don't need anyone to opt in. All this data's out there. we can identify anything anywhere, depending on what we want to do, and that's the dirty secret. I mean, I'm a small version of the NSA. Okay, seriously, we have unbelievable capabilities. It's all public data. If you want to see a good example of that, it's Chicago. The city of Chicago has the best publicly available data on everything, crime statistics, alcohol outlet locations, everything. And that was Rahm Emanuel's project. He hired this amazingly smart math guy to put all this data available. And every one of us right now can go on there, we could find out anything we want. And
so should we then, we don't need any more data, you're done.
Essentially, we have to talk. We have to. It was
a bold claim you made, so I wanted to push back.
No, at that. If I want to do, I get NIH grants and the whole bit. HIPAA, IRBs. I know the route. I've been doing it for 20-something years. And the point is that we need to understand the context in a much more holistic way. That what kinds of data are just there anyways. What can they and not just say, well, it's about surveys, opting in, opting out, and all that other kinds of stuff.
Is it a question two, or you just want?
Yeah. Well, the question is, have we thought about that? Right. We thought about these differences between how we can triangulate without any opting in or opting out, and the opting in question, how we work those things together.
Any really quick responses to this?
It's such a broad question, I think it's a little hard to respond to, right? Yeah. So we tend to, again, we regulate sectors, and we regulate certain types of data collected in the sectors. When you start triangulating and you're going out of sectors, some people are still regulated in that mix, even when they're collecting data from other sources, and some people are not. And that's essentially the sort of reality that we have. So have we thought about it? Not really.
Danny, last question.
So I want to just offer a quick data point from the MIT workshop, and it kind of piles on here. One of my colleagues, Manolis Kellis, introduced an example of the way schizophrenia research has developed in looking at genetic predispositions for schizophrenia. It ends up, he sort of demonstrated that the more data you have, the more you can actually identify what the genetic markers are, and that it's not really susceptible, at least at this point, to good sampling, because no one knows what the data looks like well enough to design a sample. So in his example, you learn a lot more from 180,000 samples than you do from 5,000. From 5,000, you learn nothing. From 180,000, you get pretty clear. And I guess I want to ask the question, especially based on Mr. Mini NSA up here. How are we doing? I'm really interested in the panel's perspective. How are we doing in making sure that as all this research happens, which it seems to be happening, I mean, despite Paul, your question about do we need all the data, it seems that a lot of people have a lot of data and are doing a lot of very extraordinary, good or bad things with it. How are we doing in making sure that the trust that essentially all of the panel members have referred to is actually being maintained? I feel that we're maybe having the wrong conversation by saying, well, maybe we could sort of slim down. I wonder how people think we're doing in making sure that with all this data that we have, probably for some good reasons, some not such good reasons, put aside assume we get rid of all the bad reasons, all the studies that could be done with small samples. When we do have really large samples, for a good reason, how are we doing in making sure that we're not screwing up?
And that is a huge question, and it goes to institutions and governance and other things we didn't touch on. Does anyone have a very quick response, knowing that these people want to eat lunch soon?
Go ahead.
Well, it's really important. I mean, this is something that we spend kind of a non-trivial amount of time kind of thinking about. How do we actually use the data that's entrusted to us in the best way possible? I think, though, instead of answering this direct question, at some point there is the volume and scale and usability of it. I mean, when we answer a clinical question, we take 1,000 studies, 1,000 reports, figure out the 100 that are relevant, 900 get thrown away, read each one of those 100. Sometimes we do that through algorithms. Actually figure out a data set from that allows us to start making clinical and operational and healthcare decisions from that. So I mean, I'm not exaggerating. 90% of it, is cutting room floor not detritus, but sometimes. So there's kind of this immense amount of trust, and more is important, but more ends up with more stuff around my ankles. When we start making decisions. So I think within this, you have to think about we really have to kind of make some human level choices at the end of this.
And we need a little data humanism to go with our data science.
I think so.
Yeah.
And
I was just going to say very, very quickly, one of the ways that that's been handled in the genomic sector is to set up controlled access databases, so that because of the sensitivity of certain kinds of information, so you can only get access to it if you prove that you are an appropriate researcher and there's an application process. It still is built on trust, and there aren't a lot of penalties at this point for misuse. It's like a little slap your hand and we won't give you any more data. Now, if you're a scientist, that does destroy your career, but even so, the members of the public think that that's not appropriate, often penalty for violating something as significant as a genomic biobank, for example.
So on the one hand, I'm going to despair for many years about what we didn't get to discuss up here. On the other hand, I think we've set the table nicely for the other two panels who can pick up some of these issues we didn't get to. But before I turn it back to Deirdre, please join me in thanking the panel.